Wren Ashworth set her father's thimble on the table between herself and her stepfather, and told him, in a voice that did not shake, that she would not marry a man twice her age to settle another man's debts. The kitchen was cold in the particular way October kitchens are cold, the fire banked too low for the hour, and somewhere above them her mother's footsteps crossed the floor and stopped, and did not come down. "It is a piece of wood," he said. "It is not an argument. It was my father's," she said, "and it is the only argument I have that matters to me, and I will keep it whether or not I keep this house." He told her then that Holden Vane had been more than generous, that Vane's patience with the family's debts had a bottom to it same as any man's, that a girl in her position did not get to weigh a dead man's whittling against a living roof over her mother's head. Wren did not answer that. She had learned in the 2 years since her father died with his name in the town's mouth like a stone in a shoe, that silence cost her less than argument, and that Josiah mistook her silence for surrender more often than not, which suited her. It did not suit her tonight. Tonight he wanted the surrender spoken aloud, and when it did not come he told her, with the flat, tired patience of a man reading out a sentence he had rehearsed, that she could keep her father's name and her father's trade, and find out how far both would carry her, because they would not carry her under his roof past sunrise. Her mother came down after all, then too late to matter, her hands twisting in her apron, and said only Wren, and could not seem to find the rest of the sentence. Wren picked the thimble up off the table before the shape of her mother's silence could put it back down for her. It had been her father's habit, this thimble, whittled from a scrap of yew, the winter she was 7, her mother's initials scratched crooked into the underside, because he had meant it as a courting gift before he ever meant it as a tool, and he had told her once, guiding her hand over a torn page with the flat of his thumb, that the thread remembers where it broke, even after you have mended it, and that this was not a flaw in mending, but the whole of its honesty. She had not understood him then. She understood him now, standing in a doorway with rain starting somewhere out past the yard wall, her whole life folded into one canvas bag, and one wooden thimble worth nothing to anyone who had not been given it. She walked. The road out of Millbrook ran along the mill stream before it climbed toward the toll bridge, and she kept to it because it was the only road she knew well enough to walk in the dark, and because at its far end, if the innkeeper's wife had not been lying, the Duke of Aldermere was paying good coin for anyone who could mend paper, without tearing it further, on account of a fire that had got into the West Wing library that spring, and left half the estate's old books swollen and split and unreadable. Wren had spent her whole childhood at her father's bench, learning exactly that work, invisible mending, paper and cloth both, the discipline of rejoining a thing so the eye could not find the seam. And it occurred to her, walking with the rain finally arriving in earnest, soaking through the wool at her shoulders, that a trade the whole town called beneath a gentleman's daughter might be the only thing standing between herself and a very long, very wet night with nowhere at the end of it. She did not cry. She had promised herself years ago, at her father's graveside, with Vane standing 2 rows back in his good coat, looking appropriately grieved, that she would not give the town the satisfaction of watching an Ashworth weep in public twice in one lifetime. She had used the allowance already, at the funeral. It was gone. By the time the lodge gates of Aldermere came into view through the rain, iron scrolled into shapes she could not make out in the dark. She had stopped feeling her feet inside her boots, and the only thing in the whole wet black night that seemed fixed and certain was the thimble in her fist. its crack worn smooth under her thumb, from 9 years of exactly this same gesture. And above the stable roof beyond the gate, a weather vane in the shape of a heron stood locked hard against the wind, facing due north, not turning at all, as if it had made up its mind about something long before she arrived, and saw no reason to reconsider now. She did not know yet what that stillness would come to mean to her. She only knew that she was cold, and that the gates were shut, and that she would have to knock. The gatehouse window showed a single candle. Wren crossed the last stretch of road at something close to a run, her bag banging against her hip, and raised her fist to the door before her courage could finish leaving her, and somewhere behind that door a dog began to bark, and a woman's voice, dry and entirely unhurried, told it to hold its noise. There was no need to wake the county over a knock at the gate. The door opened on a broad, sharp-eyed woman in a nightcap, holding a candle at a height that put Wren's whole soaked, shivering person on display without mercy. "I am looking for whoever hires the menders," Wren said, before the woman could ask. Because she had found that getting to the point first spared her the indignity of being asked to explain herself twice. The woman looked her over once, boots to bag to the fist still closed around something small. "That would be me, near enough," she said. "Mrs. Pell, housekeeper 30 years, and the nearest thing this house has had to a steward of paper since the fire, seeing as his lordship's own steward has better things to do with an afternoon than count ruined books. Come in before you catch your death on my doorstep, girl. I've buried enough people this year, without adding a stranger to the list out of politeness." The kitchen at Aldermere was 3 times the size of the Bramwell kitchen and warmer than anywhere Wren had stood in a fortnight, and Mrs. Pell set her down at the long table with bread, and a bowl of something that had clearly been meant for tomorrow's servants' dinner, and was not going to argue about being eaten tonight instead. "What's your name then, Mrs.?" Pell asked, and Wren told her, and watched the housekeeper's face do the small, careful thing that faces in Millbrook had been doing for 2 years whenever her name was said aloud, a flicker of recognition, followed by a flicker of something the person then worked hard to smooth away. "You'll be Thomas Ashworth's girl, Mrs., Pell said finally. Not a question. "I am," Wren said, and waited for whatever came next, the way she always waited now, braced without appearing to brace. What came next was only, "He bound the parish register the year I was married in it. Good clean work. Never met a man take more care over another man's paper." Wren's throat did something complicated that she refused to let reach her face. "He taught me," she said. "Then you'll do, Mrs., Pell said. And that, for the moment, was the whole of it. She was given a cot in the linen room, and told to present herself at the library at 8, and she lay awake past the hour any sensible person would have slept, turning the thimble over in her fingers in the dark, listening to a house she did not know breathing around her, and told herself that whatever waited for her past 8 o'clock could not possibly be worse than what she had already survived that day. She was, as it turned out, only partly right. The library at Aldermere occupied the whole of the West Wing's ground floor, and even 2 seasons after the fire it smelled of scorched leather and standing water, and something sweetish underneath that she would later learn was mildewed vellum, a smell she came to associate for the rest of her life with the particular ache of very old, very patient grief. Shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, half of them warped, spines cracked open like broken jaws, and in the 4th wall a tall window let in grey morning light onto a scene of such organised ruin that Wren, standing in the doorway with her bag still over her shoulder, felt something in her chest lift for the first time in 2 years. Because this, at least, was a wound she knew how to close. She was still standing there, working out where she would begin, when the door at the far end opened and a man came through it reading a letter and did not look up, and said, without any greeting at all, that he hoped whoever Pell had found this time actually knew paper and was not another agent's cousin sent to charge him double for burning what was left. Wren, who had not yet been introduced to anyone above the rank of housekeeper, and who had spent a great many months being spoken to exactly like that by exactly that kind of man, found that 2 years of practised silence deserted her all at once. "I am not anyone's cousin," she said. "I am the mender Mrs. Pell hired at midnight in the rain, and if you would like to know whether I understand paper, you might try asking me instead of the letter in your hand." That got his attention. He looked up. He was younger than she had expected of a duke, dark-haired, tired around the eyes in a way that had settled in and did not look temporary, and he studied her for a long moment with an expression she could not read, before something that was almost, but not quite, amusement crossed his face and was gone before it fully arrived. "Forgive me," he said. "It has been an ungenerous morning. You'll be the mender then, I am Aldemir." "Wren Ashworth," she said, and watched his face do the thing misses. Pell's had done the night before, the flicker and the smoothing over, except that on him it did not smooth all the way. It caught somewhere behind his eyes and stayed caught, and he said only Ashworth, in a voice gone carefully level, as though testing the weight of the name in his mouth before deciding what to do with it, and then he said nothing further about it at all, which she noticed, and filed away, the way she filed away every small unexplained thing, because a torn page always told you where to look before it told you why. The work itself steadied her in a way nothing else that week could have. She spent her first days sorting the ruined volumes by degree of damage, the merely singed set aside from the truly waterlogged, and Mrs. Pell brought her paste and thread, and a stack of good linen rag paper requisitioned from the estate office without, Wren gathered, entirely proper authorization, and by the end of the first week her hands had found their old rhythm again. The rhythm her father had drilled into her at his own bench, work from the edges inward, never force a page that resists you. Let the paper tell you which way its grain wants to lie. The household watched her with the frank, unhurried curiosity of people with little else to occupy an afternoon. A stable boy named Tam, perhaps 13, with a gap in his front teeth and no talent whatsoever for minding his own business, took to finding excuses to linger in the library doorway, asking what each ruined book had been before the fire got it, and Wren found she did not mind him, because he asked honestly and listened to the answers, which was more than she could say for most of Millbrook. It was Tam who told her, in the offhand way children deliver the most important information, that his lordship's steward, Mr. Vane, had been up from the estate office to look in on the library work twice already that week, though never when she was there, and always just after, as if he were counting the shelves. Wren did not know yet what to make of that. She only knew the name landed in her stomach like a dropped stone, because Holden Vane was the very man her stepfather had wanted her to marry, the same man whose generous forgiveness of a dead draper's debts had bought him a claim on her whole family's gratitude and, it seemed, on her future. And it had not occurred to her until this moment, standing in a duke's ruined library 4 hours from home, that the world might be smaller and more carefully arranged than she had allowed herself to believe. She said nothing of this to Tam. She went back to her bench and picked up the next book, a heavy estate ledger with its spine split clean down the fold, its pages stuck together in a solid, water-swollen block, and ran her thumb along the broken binding the way her father had taught her, feeling for where the true tear ended and where careless handling had widened it, and told herself, not for the first time that week, that whatever this house held, it was not her business to go looking for it. She was wrong about that too, though it would be some weeks yet before she understood how wrong. And in the meantime there was mending enough to keep her hands and her mind both occupied, and a first sign, small and easy to miss, that the quiet, orderly ruin of her new life was not going to stay quiet for long. On the Friday of that first week, a rider came up the long drive at a pace that scattered gravel, and Mrs. Pell, watching from the kitchen window with her mouth gone thin, said only that Lady Cordelia Ashe did not usually announce herself with that much noise, unless her ladyship's own mother was somewhere behind her in a worse temper still, and that Wren had best keep to the library today, and let the house sort out whatever this was on its own. Aldermere by daylight, once Wren had a week to learn its shape, revealed itself gradually, the way a face reveals itself once you stop being afraid of it. Grey stone gone gold in the low autumn sun, a lake at the foot of the south lawn that steamed faintly on cold mornings, an avenue of limes losing their leaves in slow gold drifts that Tam was made to sweep and did badly. She learned the sounds of the place, the particular groan of the east door, the way the kitchen bell carried differently depending on the wind, and she learned, without meaning to, the sound of the Duke's step in the library corridor, unhurried, deliberate, always pausing very slightly before he came through the door, as though bracing himself for whatever the room might still be grieving that day. He came often. He said little on most visits, only stood at the window with his hands behind his back looking out at the lake while she worked, and twice she caught him turning a heavy signet ring around and around on his finger, a habit she recognised because her own hand did something similar with the thimble, and she thought, watching him, that grief wore the same shape on a duke as it wore on a draper's daughter, whatever the difference in the coats. It was on the 9th day that Lady Cordelia Ashe herself came down to the library, trailing a chaperone and an air of someone doing her duty rather than following her inclination, and introduced herself to Wren with perfect, practised warmth before turning her attention to the ruined shelves and saying, to no one in particular, that it was a great pity about the books. Though she supposed a library one did not read was no great loss to some families. She was not unkind. Wren noted that carefully, the way she noted everything, because it would have been easier, in the weeks that followed, if Lady Cordelia had been unkind, and she was not once, not even when she had every reason in the world to be. By the 4th week Wren had learned enough of the house's arithmetic to understand the obstacle standing in front of whatever this strange, careful friendship with the Duke was quietly becoming. And the obstacle had a name and a face and a very old claim on the Aldermere lands, because Lady Cordelia's family estate marched along the whole eastern boundary, and the Dowager Duchess, Julian's grandmother, had apparently decided some years before the old Duke's death that the two properties belonged, joined the same way the two families' fortunes were joined, by marriage, by contract, by the tidy arithmetic of adjoining fields. Wren learnt this the way she learned most things at Aldermere, by being present in rooms people forgot to lower their voices in, and she learned the Dowager herself on the same afternoon she learned the betrothal, because the old woman came down to the library unannounced, leaning on a stick she did not appear to need, and looked at Wren for a long moment with an expression of frank, unhurried appraisal that made Wren feel very much like a ledger being checked for errors. "So you are the mender," the dowager said. "I am told you sat at the Duke's own table for supper on Tuesday." "I sat at Mrs. Pell's table, your Grace, in the servants' hall," Wren said, because the smaller lie would not survive the larger truth, and she had never seen the use in either. His lordship happened to be passing through, and stayed to eat standing at the sideboard, which I am given to understand is not his custom. The dowager's mouth did something that was almost a smile and chose, deliberately, not to become one. "Ashworth," she said. "That is a Millbrook name." "It is my name, your Grace," Wren said. "There was a Millbrook scandal some years back," the dowager said, still watching her. "A bookbinder found to have falsified an account for the wool cooperative ruined 6 small investors, hanged himself in shame before the assizes could finish with him properly, if I recall it right." "He did not falsify anything," Wren said, and the words came out flatter and harder than she had meant them to. "And he did not hang himself. His heart failed him in his sleep, 11 months after the accusation, with his name never once cleared, and the true culprit never once named. And I would ask your Grace not to recite a story you were not present for as though it was settled history, because it is not settled, and I have not settled it." The library went very quiet. Somewhere behind the dowager, in the doorway, Wren became aware that the Duke himself had arrived and stopped, unseen or unremarked by his grandmother, listening. The dowager studied Wren for a long moment more, and something in her stony old face shifted very slightly. Not warmth, nothing so generous as warmth, but a kind of recalibration, the look of a woman revising a sum. "We shall see," she said at last, which was not an apology and was not meant to be one, and left the library with her stick striking the floor at a pace considerably brisker than the one she had entered with. Julian did not come fully into the room for a moment after she had gone. When he did, he said only, quietly, that his grandmother did not often revise her opinions, and that Wren had just watched something rare happen in this house, and Wren, still shaking faintly with the aftermath of her own anger, said that she had not meant it as a performance for anyone's benefit. And he said, "I know, that is precisely why it worked." It was the first time he had spoken to her, as though she were something other than a useful pair of hands attached to a familiar and troubling name, and she carried the shape of that sentence with her for the rest of the day the way she carried the thimble, worn smooth from handling, not sure yet what it would come to mean. The dinner 3 nights later, at which Lady Cordelia and her mother were formally present, and Wren was not invited, being neither family nor quite servant, taught her the second half of the arithmetic she had already half worked out on her own. Because Mrs. Pell, arranging the good china with the flat efficiency of a woman who had arranged it for every crisis this family had survived in 30 years, told her without being asked that the betrothal contracts had been drawn up before the old Duke died and never formally set aside, that the new Duke had inherited both his father's lands and his father's arrangements in the same breath, and that a man in his position did not simply walk away from a contract that half the county considered settled, whatever his private feelings on the matter might be, and that Wren, whoever she was, and whatever she had become in this house in a month, would do well to remember that private feelings and public duty were 2 entirely different ledgers in a house like this one, and that the Duke had been raised his whole life to balance the second before he ever consulted the first. Wren said that she understood that perfectly well, and had no expectations whatsoever regarding either ledger. Mrs. Pell looked at her for a moment with an expression of weary, affectionate scepticism, and said only, and went back to the china. And Wren, left alone in the kitchen with a stack of dinner rolls she had not been asked to butter, and had buttered anyway for something to do with her hands, found that Mrs. Pell's silence carried considerably more weight than her words had, and that it landed somewhere very near the place where the thimble's crack sat worn smooth beneath her thumb. The two-hander came, as these things do, on a night neither of them had planned for it. Wren was working late in the library, the last of the estate ledgers spread across her bench for assessment, when Julian came in without his usual pause at the door, dropped into the chair opposite her, with the particular exhausted carelessness of a man who has run out of performances for the day, and said, without preamble, that his father had died in this room. She set down the page she was holding. "I did not know that," she said. "Few people do," he said. "He had a seizure at that desk, there, going over the harvest accounts, and I found him at breakfast the next morning, when he did not come down, and I have never once in 2 years been able to make myself move that desk to a different room, though I have thought about it every week since. I am sorry," she said, and did not offer him anything more elaborate than that, because she had learned from the inside what elaborate condolence was worth to a person actually grieving, which was nothing at all. He looked at her for a long moment. "You did not offer to move the desk for me," he said. "Everyone else offers to move the desk. My aunt has suggested it 4 times. It is not my desk to move," Wren said. "Grief has its own furniture, and you do not get to rearrange someone else's." Something in his face eased fractionally the way a held breath eases. "My father spent the last year of his life terrified that Vane's numbers did not add the way Vane said they added," he said, "and I never once asked him what he meant by that. Because he died before I thought to ask, and now I cannot ask anyone, because the only man who kept those books before Vane was your father, and your father is not here to ask either." Wren went very still. "What are you telling me?" she said. "I am telling you," he said, "that I do not think either of us is in this library by accident, whatever Pell would have you believe about a fire and a want of hands." She wanted, in that moment, to ask him everything, to lay the whole shape of her family's ruin on the desk between them, and demand he explain it, but before she could find the first word the door opened, without a knock, and Holden Vane came through it with a ledger under his arm, and an expression of mild, practised apology already arranged on his face, saying that he was sorry to intrude. He had only come to collect the harvest figures for the morning's accounts. He had not realised his lordship was occupied. He smoothed the front of his coat as he said it, a small unconscious gesture, cuffs straightened, collar checked. The gesture of a man making sure his surfaces were correct before anyone looked too closely at what lay beneath them, and Wren, watching him do it, felt the whole warm, dangerous ease of the last few minutes go cold and careful again. "Not at all," Julian said, his own voice sliding back into its public register as smoothly as a door closing. Miss Ashworth was just finishing for the night. Wren understood a dismissal when she heard one, even a gentle one, and gathered her things, and it was only when Vane held the door for her on her way out, with perfect courtesy, that he said, quietly, for her ears alone, that he had heard she was Thomas Ashworth's daughter, and that he had always thought it a great shame. What happened to her father, a great shame. And that he hoped she would let him know if there was ever anything he could do to make her situation here more comfortable. There was nothing in the words themselves to object to. There was something in the half-second before his eyes caught up with his smile that made the back of her neck go cold, and she said only that she was quite comfortable. "Thank you," and walked the length of the corridor to the linen room, with her heart going harder than the encounter seemed to warrant, and lay awake that night turning the thimble over and over, thinking that she had just agreed, without quite meaning to catalogue the entire damaged archive, ledgers and all, at the Duke's request, and that whatever bargain that turned out to be. She suspected already that she would come to regret the ease with which she had made it. The discrepancy revealed itself to her hands before it revealed itself to her mind, the way such things always had, ever since her father first set her to work at his bench. She was 3 weeks into the full catalogue, working through a run of harvest ledgers from 6 and 7 years back, when her fingers smoothing a torn corner flat before pasting a new hinge into the binding, caught on a line of figures that did not sit right against the page the way ink ought to sit when it has dried at the same time as its neighbours. She held the page to the window. The entry was a rent total for the Eastern farms, and beside it, in a hand got up to look like the steady, patient copperplate the rest of the ledger was written in. Someone had altered a 7 into what was now unmistakably a 2, the loop of the 7's cross-stroke still faintly visible beneath the newer ink, if you knew, as she knew, exactly how much pressure a nervous hand puts into covering its own tracks. A false hand always presses too hard, where a true one barely touches, her father used to say, watching her work, and she had thought it only a rule about paper, until this exact moment, sitting alone in a cold library at 9 o'clock at night, with a Duke's rent ledger open in her lap, and 5 years of altered 7s waiting, she now suspected, to be found if she only knew where to look. She did not sleep that night either. She found Mrs. Pell in the kitchen before 6, and told her in a low voice what she had found, and Mrs. Pell, who had run this house through 2 dukes and a great many smaller storms, did not look surprised so much as tired, the particular tiredness of someone watching a suspicion she had carried a long time finally grow a shape she could point to. "Your father used to say a thing to me once, Mrs." Pell said, when he came up to rebind the parish register, that a thing that is gone asks nothing of you, but a thing that is only buried waits. And I did not understand him then, and I am beginning to understand him now, sitting here with you. If you are asking me what to do with what you have found, I will tell you what I know, which is that your father, God rest him, never trusted a client he did not fully believe in, and he had a habit, when he did not trust a man, of keeping the truth of a job somewhere the man in question would never think to look, sewn up quiet in the spine of some other book entirely, where only another bookbinder's eye would ever find it. Wren felt something in her chest go very still and very clear. He bound half this library himself, she said. Before Vane's time, Mrs. Pell said, which means if your father ever laid eyes on the true numbers before somebody changed them, and did not trust what he saw, there is likely a book on those shelves right now, holding more than its pages were ever meant to hold, and you are the only person living who would know how to find it. She confronted Vane before she went looking, because it seemed to her the honest thing to do, and because some small stubborn part of her still hoped he would have an answer that made all of it innocent. She found him in the estate office on a grey afternoon, and he received her with the same unhurried courtesy he gave everyone, offered her a chair she did not take, and listened without visible alarm while she told him, carefully, that she had found an altered figure in the 7-year ledger, and wondered whether he could explain it. He did not deny it outright. That surprised her more than a denial would have. "I will tell you something, Miss Ashworth, since you have clearly already decided to go looking regardless of what I say," he said, and folded his hands on the desk in front of him. "When the old Duke died, this estate was 3 bad harvests from real trouble, debts his father had let run for a decade, and I made certain adjustments over some years to keep the tenants fed and the roof sound, and the name of Aldermere out of the county's mouth as a house in decline. And I will not apologise to you for choices that kept people in their homes. You may call that theft if you like. I call it stewardship of a kind your own father, for all his fine principles, was never in a position to practice. Because principles are cheap when you have never once had to choose between a true number and a family's supper. It was, she thought afterward, a genuinely good argument, delivered without a flicker of the courtesy cracking, and she hated him a little more for how good it was, because it meant she would have to answer it with something better than outrage. My father chose a true number over his own name, she said finally, and it killed him, slowly, over 11 months, and you let the whole county believe he made your choice instead of his own. That is not stewardship. That is a man borrowing another man's ruin to cover his. Something moved behind Vane's eyes then, very briefly, gone before she could be sure she had seen it at all, and he said only, with perfect evenness, that he was sorry she saw it that way, and that he hoped, for her own sake, she would consider very carefully what she believed she was about to do, because the dead could not be helped by digging them up, and the living had a way of paying for other people's excavations. She went looking that same night, working from memory of her father's hand, the particular spines he had favoured, the almanacs and account books he had bound in the years just before he died, and she found it past midnight in the fourth aisle, an estate accounts volume, its spine slightly thicker than its neighbours, in a way no one but a bookbinder's daughter would ever have noticed. And when she worked the old paste free with a blade held flat and steady the way her father had taught her, working from the edges inward, letting the paper tell her which way its grain wanted to lie, 3 folded sheets slid free from inside the binding, brittle with age, covered in her father's own unmistakable hand. True figures set out plainly beside the false ones Vane had entered in the public ledger, and beneath them a short note, dated the month before her father died, that read, "If I am ever made to answer for numbers I did not write, let whoever finds this know that Thomas Ashworth kept honest books to the end, and loved his daughter Wren more than any ledger he ever balanced." She read it 3 times before the words would hold still on the page. She was still sitting there, the true accounts spread in her lap, tears finally arriving 2 years late and all at once, when she heard the library door open behind her, and turned, already knowing before she saw his face that it would not be Julian. And it was not. It was Tam, white and breathless, saying that a rider had just come up from Millbrook with a letter for her, urgent, and that Mrs. Pell had sent him running the moment it arrived, because the messenger said it could not wait for morning. The letter was from her mother, 4 lines only, informing her that word had reached Millbrook, through channels her mother did not name, that Wren had used her position at Aldermere to entangle the Duke himself, that Halden Vane, out of what her mother called continuing Christian charity toward a family that had done nothing to deserve it, had warned them of exactly this kind of scheming before it could ruin them all a second time, and that Josiah had forbidden any further correspondence, and would certainly forbid any Bramwell from setting foot near whatever ceremony Wren imagined she was now entitled to. Wren sat with the true accounts in one hand, and her mother's letter in the other, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its completeness, that Vane had not waited for her to come to him. He had already gone to Millbrook first. The word tidy came up more than once in the days that followed, and Wren came to hate it the way she had once hated the word settled. It was the dowager who used it first, having been told in outline what Wren had found, summoning her to the small parlour with an expression that was not unkind, and was not, on this occasion, going to be moved by anything Wren said. "There is a tidy way through this," the dowager said. Vane resigns quietly, citing his health. "We make good whatever restitution can be made to the tenants without a public accounting, and your father's name is corrected privately, in the parish record, without ever needing to be shouted from a church door. It spares the estate a scandal on the very week of a wedding, and it spares you, my dear, the indignity of your own family's shame being read aloud for the county's entertainment." "No," Wren said. Just that, at first, the same flat words she had given her stepfather across a cold kitchen table, and then, because the dowager deserved better than a bare refusal, the rest of it. "My father spent 11 months dying under a name that was not his crime, and I will not trade his good name for the estate's comfort a second time, not even to spare myself an ugly afternoon. If the truth costs something, then let it cost something, publicly, in the open, where it can finally stop costing him anything at all. The thread remembers where it broke, your grace, even after you have mended it, and I would rather it show than pretend the tear was never there." The dowager studied her for a long moment, and did not argue further, which Wren understood even then as a kind of respect she had not expected to earn from that particular quarter. Julian argued differently, and it was that argument, not the dowager's, that put her on the road out of Aldermere 3 days before her own wedding. He came to her in the linen room that night, his face drawn in a way she had not seen since the night he told her about his father's desk, and told her that Vane, cornered, had grown dangerous in the particular way cornered clever men grow dangerous. That word had already reached him of a fabricated claim Vane intended to lodge, questioning the legitimacy of the whole engagement, painting her as a fortune-seeking adventuress who had used a scandal to work her way into his house and his bed, and that he wanted her away from the worst of it, safe at Cordelia's family seat until the wedding, so that whatever ugliness Vane tried to spread would find no target standing in front of it. "I am not asking you to hide," he said. "I am asking you to let me take the first blow instead of you, for once." She heard, in that moment, not the shelter he meant, but the echo of every room in her life where someone had decided, on her behalf and for her own good, what she could and could not be trusted to stand through. "I have been sent away for my own good before," she said. "It is usually the moment just before everyone decides I was the problem all along." "That is not what this is," he said. "It is exactly what this always is," she said, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned long ago that the quietest refusal carried the farthest, and she packed her bag that same night and told Mrs. Pell only that she needed a few days to think, and left before dawn with the true accounts folded inside her coat and the thimble in her fist, and spent the 2 days that followed at old Mr. Oldacre's cottage on the Millbrook Road, her father's oldest friend in the binding trade, who fed her and did not ask questions and let her sit by his fire turning the same thought over and over, which was whether a man who sent you away to protect you was any different, in the end, from a man who sent you away because he had already begun to doubt you. The wedding day came in hard and clear, a rinsed winter morning with frost still silvering the churchyard grass, and Wren stood in the small vestry with Mrs. Pell, fastening the last hooks of her gown, and did not look at the window, because she had decided, somewhere in the last cold hour before dawn, that whatever waited on the other side of that church door, she would rather walk through it than be found to have run. Mrs. Pell had come herself to fetch her back from Oldacre's cottage the night before, arriving on the estate cart with Tam driving and the true accounts, which Wren had left behind in her hurry, wrapped safe in oilcloth under the seat, and had said only, climbing down stiff from the cold, that she had not raised 3 of her own children, and buried a husband to watch a fool girl throw away a good man, over a misunderstanding neither of them had the sense to say aloud properly, and that Wren was going to come home and marry her duke, and have this argument with him after the vows, instead of before, because a wedding postponed twice was a wedding the whole county would talk about, forever, and Wren, half laughing and half weeping in the cart's cold straw, had not had it in her to argue. Now, in the vestry, with the organ sounding faintly through the wall, she could hear the church filling, the particular hush and rustle of a full congregation settling into pews, and she made herself walk to the vestry door and look. The Duke's side of the church was packed to the doors, tenants and household and half the county besides. Her own side held perhaps a dozen souls. Mrs. Pell's family, Old Acre, Tam scrubbed pink and uncomfortable in a borrowed coat, and one long aching stretch of empty pew where her mother and stepfather should have been sitting and were not. She did not have long to feel the weight of it before the organ found its opening chord, and Mrs. Pell took her arm and told her, low and fierce, that empty pews had never once stopped a wedding, and were not going to start today. She walked the aisle with her chin level and her eyes on Julian, who stood at the front of the church with his grandmother beside him, and an expression on his face that told her, before she had covered half the distance, that he had seen the empty pew too, and had not looked away from it, and was already turning something over behind his eyes. The service began. It did not finish the way either of them had planned. It was at the moment the clergyman asked whether any person present knew just cause why this couple should not be joined that Heldon Vane rose from a seat near the back, immaculate as ever, and said in a voice pitched to carry that he was very sorry to intrude on so happy an occasion, but that a matter of grave importance regarding the bride's family and her father's true character had come to light, and that he could not in good conscience allow the ceremony to proceed without the congregation hearing it. A murmur went through the church like wind through standing grain. Wren felt Julian's hand find hers, steady, and did not let go. "Then let us hear it," Julian said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the church, "and let us hear something else alongside it, because I have in my possession Thomas Ashworth's own true accounts, in his own hand, describing precisely how his figures were altered, and precisely by whom, and I think this congregation is owed the whole of the ledger, not half of it, before anyone here decides which story to believe." He nodded, and Mrs. Pell came forward from the front pew where she had been sitting with the oilcloth parcel in her lap, and Wren stepped forward herself, because it was, after all, her father's hand and her own work that had rejoined the torn pages, and she unfolded the true accounts before the whole church and began to read. Her voice steady in a way that surprised even her, the honest figures against the false, the note her father had left behind naming exactly what he feared and exactly why, and the church went utterly silent around her, silent enough that she heard, quite clearly, the small sharp intake of breath from the back pew, where Vane had gone very still. It was when she reached the final line of her father's note, that he had kept honest books to the end, and loved his daughter more than any ledger, that Vane moved. A single sudden lunge up the aisle toward her, hand out for the papers, his careful composure gone entirely, his voice cracking into something raw and unrehearsed, as he said that she had no right, that the papers were forged, that she would ruin them all, and it was Julian who caught his wrist before he reached her, quietly, without violence, and held it, and said only that a man reaching to snatch proof out of a woman's hands in front of 200 witnesses had just done more to convict himself than any ledger ever could. The dowager rose then, from her seat at the front, leaning on her stick, and said, into the ringing silence, that she had known Thomas Ashworth's work for 30 years, and had been wrong, publicly and completely wrong, to ever let a rumour stand in place of a fact, and that she would say so to anyone in the county who cared to ask her directly. Vane did not stay to hear the rest. He went, in the end, with what dignity he could still gather, his coat straightened one final time out of pure habit, and said only, quietly, to Julian, that he had done what he believed the estate required, and that he supposed a man was owed the right to believe that of himself even at the end, and Julian let him go without another word, because there was nothing further to be won by keeping him. It was in the hush that followed, the whole church still catching its breath, that Julian turned from the door where Vane had gone, and looked down the aisle at the long empty pew on Wren's side, and made the decision that the whole county would still be talking about at Christmas. He walked down from the altar, past Wren, past the murmuring rows, and out through the church's side door into the cold morning, and returned some minutes later, the whole congregation twisted round in their pews to watch, with Grace Bramwell on his arm, pale and shaking and weeping openly, having stood the whole service outside the churchyard wall, unable to make herself come in, and unable to make herself leave either. And he walked her the length of the aisle himself, and settled her into the empty pew, and said, for the whole church to hear, that a mother belonged beside her daughter on a day like this one, whatever a foolish man's pride had tried to forbid, and that he would count it a personal honour if the rest of the congregation on that side would not mind a full pew for once. They did not mind. Tenants and servants alike shifted along without being asked twice, and by the time the clergyman found his place again in the service, Wren's side of the church stood as full as the other, her mother's hand gripped tight in her own, and the ceremony went forward at last in a silence that had turned, somewhere in the last quarter hour, from dread into something very near reverence. They were married before noon, and the wedding breakfast that followed was, by every account Mrs. Pell gave afterward, the strangest and best the county had seen in a generation, half triumph and half confession, and it was well into the afternoon before Wren and Julian found 5 quiet minutes alone in the library, of all places, standing among the shelves she had spent 4 months mending. "I sent you away because I was afraid of exactly what happened this morning," he said, "and I told myself it was for your protection, and only understood on the road back from Alderker's cottage that it looked, from where you stood, exactly like every other time someone decided your safety was worth more than your say in it." "I know," she said. "Mrs. Pell has been telling me the same thing in a cart for 2 days. I am not sorry I went to Old Acres. I needed to decide for myself whether I was walking back down that aisle, and I could not have decided it standing in your shadow. Then decide something for me now," he said, "while we are still being honest with each other in this room. Tell me your terms." She considered him for a long moment, turning the thimble over once in her pocket out of long habit. "My father's name is entered corrected in the parish record, publicly, this week, not privately," she said. "Every family Vane wronged is repaid in full before the spring planting, and their names read out alongside my father's, because a cleared name is worth nothing kept quiet in a drawer, and you never again decide, on your own, what I am too fragile to stand through. Those are my terms." He said that he accepted every one of them, and that he had no wish to negotiate a single line, and there was a small dry humour in the way he said it that told her he meant every word, and was also, faintly, teasing her, a rare thing in him, rationed the way his grandmother rationed her approval, and she found that she had missed it without knowing she'd been waiting for it. A year turned before the story fully settled into the shape the county would tell it in for a generation after. Holden Vane left for the coast within the month, and was not spoken of again, except as a caution told to young stewards. Lady Cordelia Ashe, freed at last of a contract she had never wanted any more than Julian had, married a naval captain the following autumn in a ceremony Wren attended gladly, and told her afterward, laughing, that she had spent 2 years praying someone would find a good enough reason to release them both, and that she supposed a scandal involving forged ledgers was not the reason she had pictured. But she was not about to complain about results. The dowager kept her word about the county, and more besides, and came, in time, to sit with Wren over needlework of an evening, with something that was, if not quite warmth, at least a steady and reliable respect. And in the spring, with the lake unfrozen and the limes coming green again along the drive, Wren carried her infant daughter down the Millbrook Road to the house she had once been cast out of in the rain, and found the kitchen door opened before she had finished knocking, her mother's face already wet, Josiah nowhere in evidence, and Wren gathered from her mother's careful silence on the subject, not likely to be for some time yet. She set the child down at the same table where she had once set down her father's thimble, and took from her pocket a second thimble, newly carved, matched close to the first, with her daughter's own initials scratched crooked and proud into its underside, the way her father had once scratched her mother's, and told the child, though she was far too small yet to understand a word of it, that the thread remembers where it broke, even after you have mended it, and that this was not a flaw in the mending, but the whole of its honesty, and above the stable roof at Aldermere, 4 hours and a whole lifetime away, the old heron weathervane, freed at last of the rust that had locked it north through every hard season of the story, turned easy and unhurried in the spring wind, facing wherever the day happened to be blowing. If this one kept you by the fire a little longer than you meant to stay tonight, I am glad of the company, because Wren's mended thread and that stubborn heron finding its turn again are exactly the kind of thing this hearth was built for. Tell me in the comments which moment held you tightest, whether it was the thimble on that first cold table, or her mother crossing the churchyard at last, because I do read every one, and if you would like another story like it waiting the next time the fire is lit, staying close by subscribing to Htul H-channel _name Eve. Costs you nothing, and means the kettle's already on when I come back. Until then, sleep gently, be kind to whoever is closest to you tonight, and I will see you at the next fire.